On Sunday, we started a new short series of about 3 weeks called Wisdom at Work, and it's a study of the purposes that God has for work in our lives, for our careers, for our ambitions, our drive, the need to make money. All of these things are large features and important themes in the book of Proverbs. And so we're going to spend about 3 Sundays looking at those themes. On Sunday morning, we talked about why we work. We work because we're in a fallen world. And if you want your work to get consumed and fall into decay and disrepair, all you have to do is stand still. And so we talked about some of those themes. There were 3 very good questions resulting from that sermon. First one, how do we know what is an appropriate amount of work and leisure? How do we know when you're working too much or spending too much leisure time? So here are some thoughts about that from just my own point of view. I measure appropriate amount of work basically by the responsibilities that I have at any given time in the total picture of my life. When Bridget and I were young, we were married very young. I was 20, she was 21, and so we had a long period in our early marriage where we had no kids. We didn't have a lot of responsibilities, and so we could just work, and we did all kinds of work. I was, in addition to being an intern at a large church, I was going to seminary and completed that in like 2 years, which I don't recommend doing. It near ruined me, but I did it. And I was teaching violin lessons and playing in orchestras and string quartets and all kinds of stuff. And so if you were to look at our lives at that time, it was just an incredible amount of work that was happening there. And why was that? Because we didn't have the responsibilities of children and so forth. So at different stages of life, we have cut back the amount of work that we can do. There was a long period where Bridget was focused on raising Dylan and Malcolm and homeschooling them and being there for them. And so her out-of-the-home working life was very limited. And it also put limits on my working life. When I became a father, I didn't really want to spend all my time working. I wanted to spend my time with my kids. And because I just loved doing it, and I didn't want to miss it. And so I would set aside large blocks of time to spend with Dylan and later Malcolm, and especially when they were very young, that took up a lot of time. And so the amount of time I allotted each week for work, in my case, being a pastor, and also being a musician, a working musician, I just allotted less time to those things and made more time to be at home. Well, we're not quite in the same situation now. Our sons are grown. They're still with us happily, but they've got their own lives and they're busy, and they've got their own agendas. So we have a different relationship with them. It doesn't require the concentrated time that you need to spend with young children and teenagers sometimes. So the amount of work that I can do, I'm freed up to do more of those kinds of things, except that sometimes illness intervenes, and sometimes you take on the role of a caregiver. And so in caregiving, both your leisure time and your work time shrinks, and you have to allocate time much more carefully. So, in answer to that question, what is an appropriate amount of work time or leisure time? I would say look at the totality of your life, at the big picture of your responsibilities, and that starts to tell you how much should go to a career, how much should go to your relationships, which I differentiate from like pure leisure. You spending time with your kids and building up your relationship with them, that's another kind of work activity. It's not purely, it's often not restful at all. So let those larger responsibilities and the changes in those responsibilities inform your decisions about how you spend your time in work and leisure. That's just a sketch of an answer to that very important question. How does a person balance, question number 2, how does a person balance the desire for serving God versus letting work drive one's self-esteem? Keen question there. And the reality is that a lot of people go into ministry, missions work. A lot of people volunteer at church because they need to be needed. They are working to fill something inside themselves, to either prove their value or prove it to others, prove it to themselves, whatever it may be. Lots and lots of people go into ministry, both paid and volunteer, for self-esteem reasons. And what I would say is, if that's why you go into ministry, you're going down. There's no other way to put it. That's not going to end well, because ministry is not kind to your self-esteem. It's just not. I know that there are ministers, pastors, missionaries out there who can turn it into a big ego boost. But if they're doing that, that means they're actually neglecting or abusing some significant part of their calling. So how do you balance serving God against letting your work be driven by self-esteem? I would just say in serving God, our sense of self needs to be grounded in something other than the traditional ways we get self-esteem. Affirmation from other people, affirmation from authority figures, a sense of getting a return on investment, doing a smart thing and seeing good results. All of those kinds of measures that we normally use to say, hey, I'm a pretty effective person. I kind of know what I'm doing here. A lot of those don't apply. So your self-esteem in ministry, and this is not just paid, volunteer as well, perhaps even more so. Your self-esteem has to be grounded in who Christ is and what he has done for you. And that's what keeps you going in the work. So I would say this is not something to balance in ministry. I would say you really want to shift your ministry labor, your self-esteem away from the labor that you do in ministry and onto the Lord himself. It's the only way. No other way works. And when you see people trying to do ministry out of a needy self, you're looking at somebody who's going to use people up, and tremendous harm is going to come from that. It's not that you maintain illusions about being a needy person in ministry. Everyone in ministry is needy. It's a question of where those needs are met. We do not meet our needs from self-esteem steroids. We just can't do that. Because in ministry, that just gets amplified into all sorts of abusive kinds of practices in relation to people. So that's a very good question, and there's a lot more we might say about that. Here is a third question. Often, work and drive can be driven by competition or comparison. Is this a part of the design of God's gift of work and drive, or are they effects of the fall, and are they a barrier? What a great question. I know what my answer is supposed to be. As the pastor, I'm supposed to say that competition and comparison never enter into anything, and that you should only work for God and never be in competition with other people. So since I'm supposed to say that, let me start out by not saying it. Competition and comparison are a part of human relationships and a part of how we grow. If you're an athlete playing on a team, if you're a musician playing in a group, if you are a student and you're looking at the other members of the class, there's always an element of asking the question, where am I in relation to the group? And am I keeping up? Am I ahead of the pack? Am I behind? And so these kinds of measurements are not wrong. And sometimes they're a spur to tremendous creativity in our work. I saw an interview recently, or a conversation between the legendary music producer Rick Rubin and the legendary musician Paul McCartney, Sir Paul, I guess we're supposed to call him. And they were talking about all sorts of aspects. I think there are like 6 episodes of this conversation on Hulu. It's fascinating stuff. And at one point, they talked a little bit about competition. And Rubin asked McCartney, did that play any role? And McCartney talked about the fact that they were kind of looking at the Beach Boys at different points, and that when the Beach Boys would come out with an album and they'd do something, then it would spur some thoughts among the Beatles, and they'd say, well, we could do something like that. It wouldn't be the same, but we could try this. Competition and comparison can be very healthy things. Obviously, and I'll get back to what I'm supposed to say, obviously, competition and comparison can become toxic. And so what do you do with that? I, as a leader, as a parent, as a teacher, I try not to compare students, kids, church people to each other. I try to take each person on his or her own terms. And because that kind of comparison from an authority figure, why can't you be more like this person? That's never a good motivator for someone to do well, particularly in matters of godliness. And so we've all been hit by that kind of comparison. And we can do it to ourselves, and both in terms of cutting ourselves down and in terms of puffing ourselves up. Remember, Paul says to the Corinthians, when you compare yourselves with yourselves, you're not wise, because the standard's way off. And so there are warnings in Scripture about comparison of that kind. And so we need to recognize those problems, that ultimately while other people and their practices, their habits, they might give us new ideas. They might spur our creativity. They might say, hey, you better pull up your socks and get with the program here. It might have that effect. But spiritually, it might also have the effect of being condemning or a spur to arrogance. So we just keep those things in mind. In terms of work, I would say pay attention to the healthy effects of competition. It's not bad to look at what someone else does and say, I have some work to do. That's a good thing, as long as we keep it in a good balance with who we are, what our goals are, what our ambitions are, and what the Lord has called us to do. So those are some of my eccentric and probably heretical thoughts on that subject. What great questions. I look forward to our next encounter on Sunday, where we will continue talking about work, and I look forward to seeing you then.